One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hey fellow cosmic hobbyists, who wouldn't love to go to check out the Apollo 11 landing site? CQH Aerospace has made this possible, and in this video, we'll see just how they did that. To get the diorama layout I wanted, I cut some pink XPS foam to the size I thought would be good for this diorama and for the space constraints in our apartment. Once that was cut, I laid out some craft paper and cut it to match the size. This allowed me to draw out some ideas and lay out my little building and cardboard walkway to see just how I wanted things to look. A couple ideas I had were to have one section of the walkway to go towards where the Little West crater was located. This was the crater where Neil Armstrong took his impromptu hike towards. Unfortunately, due to the scale of the diorama and space limitations, I was not able to add the Little West crater to this build. Some of the things I am drawing on here are the location for the tourist shuttle landing pad and the tourist play area, where they'll actually be allowed to walk on the lunar surface. I purchased this foam core board from the local dollar store and cut it into sections. I then peeled the paper backing from it, which mostly worked okay. I wanted this foam for the cement-like texture when the paper was peeled away. It looked pretty decent for the effect I was after. Here I'm cutting the foam into smaller pieces to make walls for the building, as well as barrier walls for the shuttle landing area. I put together the various pieces of the foam building structure with foam-safe superglue and used an accelerator to help it cure faster. The tourists will obviously need a way to get from the shuttle to the small museum area, so I cut out an opening that will eventually get an airlock door. Once I had some of the foam structures how I wanted them, I laid out lines directly to the XPS foam so I could start gluing things in place, such as I'm doing here for the shuttle pad retaining walls. Don't underestimate random objects for adding weight to hold the foam down while the glue is curing. I like to use the aluminum foil tape to cover the wall structures to help prevent light from bleeding through the wall panels. After this was in place, I used superglue to apply some textured styrene wall panels I had gotten from my dad. He used these on his train layout, and they worked great for my purpose as well. I was looking for a way to hide my wiring for the LED lights in the ceiling, so I cut a small piece of square styrene tubing that will get tucked in the corner. I wasn't sure how I'd like using this thin foam, but it turns out it glues well with foam-safe superglue and also sands nicely to get a smooth shape. I'll put a link to the superglue I use in the description below. I also wanted a concrete-looking surface for the shuttle landing pad, so I cut out a section to fit and glued it in place. If you remember from the beginning of the video, I had a walkway made out of cardboard for layout purposes. Well, now I'm making one out of styrene. I started with cutting out 2 circles, and these will be areas at the end and corner of the walkway. Like the rest of the walkway, there will be small interpretive signs on it, as well as tall light posts in the center of each of the round sections. Of course, the light posts will have working LEDs in them. With the structure of this walkway being made out of styrene, I was able to use my favorite solvent, Weld-On 3. Any of the gaps were filled with styrene goo, which I made from dissolving pieces of the styrene in the Weld-On 3. Once this goo cures, it makes a great filler and bonding agent in the cracks. It will also be sanded smooth once it has cured completely. I tried a couple of different mounting structures for my walkway. I first used some pieces of scale model I-beams, but didn't have enough to do the job. I then designed in Tinkercad and 3D printed a mount that had 3 little mounting poles, but wasn't happy with that either. Having 3 small points of contact for the superglue didn't seem like it would be stable enough. I ended up designing and 3D printing a more solid base option. After I printed these, I cleaned them up and sanded them smooth. My thought with this walkway is that it would be up off the surface of the moon to prevent any contamination to the lunar surface by people walking around the original footprints of the Apollo 11 astronauts. Once all the walkway supports were in place, I decided it was time to start putting the outside trim onto the base. I bought this rounded trim from the local home store and thought it would look really nice, but as you'll see later in the video, this trim gets swapped out with something different. Next, I cut out a couple of small pieces of the thin foam that would end up becoming a base for another small building next to the main structure. This smaller side building would end up doubling as the spot where the speaker for my sound module would reside. I put the buildings and walkway up on raised structures so they would be out of the way when the Sculptamold was applied. Before placing a floor covering into the building, I put a coat of Vallejo basalt gray paint on everything, just in case there were any spots that the floor covering didn't cover. I didn't want any spots of white poking through from the foam below. Speaking of floor covering, I actually found a cool texture I liked in Google Images and printed it out at the correct scale on a color printer. I cut it to size and placed double-sided tape on the back of it and pressed it into place inside the small building. It turned out pretty cool. This small building is actually a small museum and welcome center, so it would need some airlock doors to go to the shuttle entry area as well as a decompression room to go outdoors. I 3D printed, primed off camera, and painted white some doors as well as an Apollo astronaut display that will eventually be a display piece on the inside for the onlookers to check out. There's definitely more to come on the inside of the Welcome Center later in the video. Since there's going to be a bunch of LEDs lighting this build, I knew I'd need to carve in some trenches to run the wires on the bottom. What's funny is that after I had already carved some of the grooves in with my X-Acto, I remembered I had a hot wire tool that made my life a lot easier. I also needed to make a recessed section for my AA battery holder. This is where one of the first struggles with my choice of trim around the edge came into light. It was too short to help provide more space to mount items on the bottom side. I also realized that my building was a bit short and didn't really match the grand design I was hoping for the location that it was in. I also wanted to have a large picture-style window structure on the front of the building, so I built an addition to the top that would literally raise the roof a bit. I used the same foam, foil, styrene sandwich structure for this addition. No Apollo 11 lunar site would be complete without the remnants of the lunar lander that is still in place. I found a good 3D printer file that I purchased from fab365.com. This model was meant to be printed on a filament printer and at a larger scale. This was probably one of the biggest headaches for me as I needed to try and figure out the size of all the print files for the HO scale. And I even needed to adjust a few things in Tinkercad for my needs. The fine bits on this lander model were definitely fragile, and if I had to do a diorama like this over again, I would have chosen a scale where I could have bought a model kit that was already available. That would have saved a lot of headaches. Just look at the pile of stuff I had to go through to make just the right size lander. I also designed and printed this custom push button switch housing that will allow you to play custom sounds from the Apollo mission. I also designed and printed this window assembly that will be installed in front of the building. Of course, being on the moon, it will be very durable and be able to protect the tourists from harmful cosmic and UV radiation. With the basic structure of the walkway complete, I wanted to add a textured walking area that would actually be a metallic structure that the magnetic boots that the tourists wear would stick to. So I utilized a screened mesh from a large strainer that I purchased from the dollar store. I laid it on the walkway and drew out the needed shapes with a black Sharpie. This material cuts easily with heavy-duty scissors, then used superglue to stick the mesh to the styrene. My feeling as I look at this surface is that this would prevent the tourists from falling either over or off the pathway when they walk. Obviously, the tourists would have no experience with walking on 1/6 Earth's gravity and would need the extra help to keep them planted. One of the things I envisioned for the large blank spaces near the ceiling of the small museum were large images of scenes from the actual Apollo mission. I chose a few different images from the Apollo archive online, sized them appropriately, then sent them and some other images that will end up in the museum to the local 1-hour photo lab to be printed on matte photo paper. If you don't have a color printer at home, this is a dirt cheap way to get some tiny prints. The image quality is great, and I'm super pleased with how they turned out. Do you remember earlier in the video how I said I wasn't completely happy with how the outside trim of the base turned out? Well, I decided that if I wanted to change it, I better do it now before it was too late. I took the old trim off and purchased a 1x2 piece of pine and cut it to size. I attached it in the same manner as the other trim, but this one is taller and allowed much more space underneath for putting the wires and modules that I needed to put under there. And it just felt more solid too. I started wiring up the micro-sized LEDs that I purchased from Amazon. I used one inside the little corridor that is the shuttle docking wing and multiple LEDs in the actual ceiling for inside the museum main structure. I stuck them in place with hot glue and soldered leads to them. I read about a great idea to use the wire from inside an old Ethernet cable for making the leads and other wire needs for this super small stuff. It worked great for this application. I also finally got some proper size shrink tubing for this small stuff also, so I used that on the solder joints. While I don't show it here, I did indeed test the lights to make sure they worked before sealing them for eternity inside their foam sarcophagus. I found that when I used this foam to build with, there were still quite a few gaps and cracks that needed to be filled in and make it all smooth. I almost bought a special foam filler made by Woodland Scenics, but read a post on a forum about using an ultralight drywall crack filler made by a company called DAP. It worked perfectly, it is super light, and spreads easily with a small spatula tool. It was also like half the price of the Woodland Scenics. Since this is a tourist spot, I figured I needed some tourists that would be hanging out inside the little museum welcome center, as well as some tourists in spacesuits for the outside. I already had 3D files of the astronauts from a previous project, but found some of just regular people on Tinkercad, so I printed them in HO scale and painted them. The spacesuits got a white color with gold reflective visors, and the people got various colored clothings. I was excited to finally be to the part of the project where I put down the Sculptamold. After I put down some painter's tape on the front of the museum for protection, I mixed the Sculptamold to a consistency of cottage cheese and started spreading it around all the parts that were laid out in the base. Wherever I decided a bigger crater needed to be, I used a small globe pencil sharpener and pressed the shape into the Sculptamold. I also used a smaller spherical-shaped plastic piece for the smaller craters. It worked pretty well, and as it was setting up, I was able to smooth it out to a smoother surface texture. As you watch me spreading the Sculptamold and paint the lava rocks for the scene, let me tell you how and why I imagined this lunar spot came to be. When CQH Aerospace developed the technologies that made the Pathfinder exploration vessel possible, a massive amount of people requested that vessels that the average person could actually ride in are also built, so an interplanetary space cruise ship was created. While this cruise ship was being planned and built, it was realized that any cruise ship needs some cool excursion spots. One of the planned locations was a 4x4 adventure on the surface of Mars. Another is this spot at the Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. CQH Aerospace had to enter into some serious negotiations with the powers that be to allow this to happen. Large donations were given to charities to sweeten the deal, and since the possibility of tourists traveling to these locations were now real, It was agreed upon to make these unique locations part of an interplanetary heritage site to protect them. Such things like no walking on the lunar surface where the original footsteps or original equipment were located had to be enacted. A separate area where tourists could walk on the lunar surface was allowed, so it was created next to the museum building itself. With all the legal stuff out of the way, this great tourist spot was built. Now that you know how this tourist spot came to be, it's time for some paint to go down. I mixed up some gray acrylic craft paint with a matte Mod Podge and a bit of water for spreadability. I added the Mod Podge to give the paint coat a tough finish. I started with dark gray on the building and landing pad area. I then used some lighter gray and very lightly painted over the raised texture to give it the look of a poured concrete-like texture. I did also start painting the roofs and structures with a blue color. I thought it would look cool, but I didn't like the way it looked, so I painted back over it with various grays to get it back to the way I liked. After all the buildings were painted, I painted the rest of the lunar surface and let it all dry before moving on. With the base coat of gray dry, I decided the shuttle landing pad needed a yellow safety stripe around the perimeter. So I taped it off and used my Pesce Talon airbrush to make the stripe with Vallejo yellow paint. I dried that and taped off some angle lines with it and hit with some Vallejo black to give it its finished look. As we check out the switch housing, I wanted to let you know that if you were wondering how you could help support this channel and its future builds and endeavors, head on over to Patreon and become a member of my Patreon page. Paid members will have access to behind-the-scenes photos and videos, as well as having their name on all my future build videos. I included a link below. Let me know what you think of it and what else I should put in there. Let's head on over and take a look at the switch housing. I airbrushed this with Vallejo jet exhaust metal color, and then I painted the letters white. I also tried painting as much of the Apollo logo as I could to match the actual logo. It was pretty small, but turned out pretty decent. Each of the push buttons on the front will play a sound bite from the actual Apollo 11 mission. I thought it would be a cool addition to this build. It also has a small slide switch for the LED lights. I used some more of the reclaimed Ethernet wire to solder some leads onto the micro LEDs for the shuttle landing pad. Once those were all wired and stuck in place, I checked and made sure they worked and used some Testors canopy and clear parts glue to put in place over the LEDs. I also actually ended up 3D printing some light covers and placed them over the LEDs later, and I'm pleased with how they turned out. I used some of the same clear parts glue to attach some clear plastic from a food container to the 3D printed window frame. I placed some weight on top of it until it dried. I figured the museum needed some interior displays, so I 3D printed an Apollo command module, which I imagined was a negotiated trade from an Earth-based museum. I also printed some interpretive sign bases, which I finished a little bit later on, and an F1 rocket engine, which is not quite to scale, but turned out pretty cool. I painted all the pieces after printing them and got them ready for installation. I also knew that a special tourist shuttle had to be designed, so I used Tinkercad again to create one from scratch with a few digital kit bashing pieces added from other files. This shuttle should hold about 8 to 10 HO scale tourists at a time. Looking in through the window, you can see the items that I put in there. You can see the portraits of the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts on the back wall, and the command module that I told you about earlier up front and to the right. And there's the F1 rocket engine also up front but to the left. In the far back right, there's an Apollo astronaut suit that's on display. And there's a bunch of miscellaneous tourists looking around the items as well as looking out the window at the lunar scenery. The tourists that are indoors are anxiously awaiting their turn to go outside. I actually thought the depth of the mesh on the walkway is not a good fit for the scale, so I used some of the lightweight spackle to fill it in a bit. It worked great, and once it dried, I painted it a metallic color. I am super pleased with how it turned out. I was trying to get the surface of this diorama to look like it was the dusty surface of the moon. To do that, I brushed down some matte Mod Podge, then sprinkled some gray tile grout onto that surface. I placed a piece of the metal mesh onto a plastic cup to act as a sieve to control how much grout went down. It turned out to not be fine enough. Once this dried, I brushed it out and did it over using a nylon stocking stretched over the same cup. I got this idea from one of Luke Towan's diorama building videos. This made a much finer texture, and I was a lot happier with how it turned out. Trying to get just the right lunar texture was a real sticking point for me. With the end in sight, I needed to wire up the sound module. I stuck it on the bottom of the foam and wired everything up with more of the reclaimed Ethernet wire and soldered everything together. This module is able to play 4 different uploaded sounds, with each sound being played at the press of one of the buttons from the switch housing that I showed you earlier. I did some dry painting to the lunar surface to add some more realism. I started with some Vallejo basalt gray, then did some highlights with lighter gray. I also used some black weathering pastel to lightly color the insides of the craters, and dry brushed the rims of the craters with a light gray made even lighter with some white mixed in. The walkway is finally super glued down. This is a real milestone. Once I had it in place, I added some weight to hold it there. I used the same technique of sending small digital files to the 1-hour photo lab to make the small interpretive signs. They turned out pretty cool. I used superglue to attach them to the walkway. I finally got to paint the lunar module. Off camera, I started with a gloss black primer coat, then airbrushed some Vallejo chrome metal color. Once that dried, I airbrushed some Tamiya transparent orange over the whole thing to give it the look like it was wrapped in a kept-on reflective insulation. I used a bunch of reference photos to try and get an accurate portrayal of the location of colors. I hand brushed silver into the appropriate parts and did the same with some Vallejo black acrylic color. I think it turned out pretty decent. I know it's not 100% accurate, but then again, I guess the tourist spot on the moon isn't real yet either.
We have to figure out something because footprints do need to be on there.
And we couldn't forget to put the little wooden heart somewhere on this diorama, and unfortunately Nettie was away for this part of it, so I decided to put it inside the engine bell, so only we know it's there. But once that was in there, I used superglue to stick the lunar module to the surface of the moon. And as I was going along on this build, I also figured the building needed a sign on it to welcome the tourists, so I enlisted the help of ChatGPT to create one for me. I modified it a bit and had it printed at the photo lab as well. I placed it on some thin styrene with Super 77 spray adhesive and stuck it to the side of the building. And with the tape peeled off the outside trim, I sanded the wood filler that I placed in the corners and gave it a coat of Vallejo black paint and waited for it to dry. I decided I would add some of the items that the Apollo crew left behind on the moon, such as life support backpacks that they wore and their overboots. Many of the items were just way too small for HO scale to make from scratch. But I did also make a lunar retro reflector in Tinkercad and printed it and placed on the lunar surface. I also superglued the tourists that were in their spacesuits to the walkway. One of them is on the long walkway facing the direction of the Little West crater taking a picture. I really wanted to add the original astronaut footprints to the lunar surface, but started to think about that a little bit too late in the build process to make that happen easily. I also finally added the light posts in the round section and wired them to power. One thing I really wanted to add was the American flag. So I used a small flag decal and stuck it to a very thin piece of foil and superglued it to a fine wire that was the scaled flagpole assembly. I placed it on the ground just like it was observed to have fallen on the ascent from the lunar surface. Once I had that in place, I called this build complete.
But why, some say, the moon? why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain?
We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Tranquility Base, use it. Roger, go ahead. Roger, our guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number one on the runway.
Thank you so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, hit the like and subscribe button and the notification icon to be alerted about future build videos as they come out.